Hi there, I'm Vicky Ball. I'm a senior lecturer in cinema and television histories at Montfort University in the UK. Many thanks to the conference organisers for inviting me to deliver this year's online lecture, and a very happy 10th birthday to Women Over 50 Film Festival. So when I was contacted to participate in the conference organisers informed me that Thelma Barlow, who was starring in Sleepless in Seattle, Julia Flynn's film that's been screened at the festival, was also participating in an In Conversation event at the festival on the 21st of September. For anyone not familiar with Thelma's work, she starred in two of Britain's most iconic TV programmes. Firstly, she played Mavis Wilton, née Riley, in Coronation Street for 26 years from 1971 to 1997, and a year later, in 1998, she starred as Dolly in Victoria Wood's sitcom Dinner Ladies. So both texts have been celebrated then by feminist academics for their inclusion and representation of so-called older women on television. And as a historian of women in television drama and sitcom, Thelma's presence at this festival provides me with an opportunity to reflect on the significance of the programmes in which she starred, and indeed the spaces offered to so-called older women, which I'm crudely periodising here as 40 plus, on British television drama and sitcoms between 1960 and the 1990s. So Coronation Street is the world's longest running television soap opera, and it was created by Tony Warren and began broadcasting on the 9th of December 1960 and remains a much loved programme on television today, its thrice weekly instalments regularly attracting over 4 million viewers. To be sure, Coronation Street wasn't Britain's first television soap. That accolade goes to the Grove family in 1954, but along with soaps such as Emergency Ward 10, Sixpenny Corner, Compact and Crossroads, was important and indeed central to the formative character of the expanding television service in the 1950s and 60s. As Deborah German has argued, despite television production being dominated by men, TV was heavily marketed to women via soap operas and daytime programmes, who, as Thuman notes, were in this formative period acknowledged to be central to the project of inserting television into domestic spaces and routines. As this very telling quote suggests from the influential TV producer Sidney Newman, the audience is a woman to be wooed, and a respectable woman at that. Yet the emergence of evening soap operas such as Coronation Street exemplify the shift in which television moves from addressing women as wives and mothers in the daytime to the evening. This, I would suggest, also recognises the shifting social status of women in the 60s, as they began to be constructed and addressed as workers as well as housewives at home in this period. Crucially, as Deborah German observes, the special relationship long thought to exist between women and television is more apparent in the way the medium has long been perceived to provide a greater breadth of opportunity for its women actors and personalities, particularly as they age, than has cinema for its women stars. And German draws here on the work of Patricia Mellencamp to substantiate this point, Mellencamp arguing television's predilection for extended families, along with its preference for medium shots over close-ups, accounts for the preeminent place of middle-aged women, so rarely seen starring in the movies after the age of 30. Since its inception in the late 1940s, television has been the stomping ground for middle-aged women. Along with the soaps that I'm going to look at shortly, there were indeed in the UK, Mellencamp here discussing the US context, but there were a number of programmes, particularly in the 60s and 70s in the UK, that featured middle-aged women, and many of which were vehicles of stars of British cinema. If we look at sitcoms produced during this period, we see Esme Cannon, Irene Handel, Hilda Baker, Thora Hird in sitcoms such as The Rag Trade, Meet the Wife, Nearest and Dearest, For the Love of Ada and Diana Dawes in Queenie's Castle. For the most part, women in these series were represented as long-suffering matriarchs or as harridans or the comedic fools. Apart from the relatively young older Dawes here, these characters were also desexualized. And to evidence this last point, we can explore briefly the representation of the blossoming romance and sexual desire of Ada and Walter in the sitcom For the Love of Ada. The sitcom's way of dealing with the sexually desiring older matriarch is for mother and daughter to trade roles and for Ada to become infantilized. And in this way, Ada's lusting sexual desire is sidestepped, or at the very least contained safely via comedy. Yet, along with sitcoms providing a second career to stars of British cinema, the sitcoms of the period also enabled older female actors to forge a career in TV. Carmel McShane, for instance, was 47 when she began playing the titular character in Burrell's Lot. The sitcom, based on the experience of Margaret Powell, followed a charwoman as she decided to undertake a philosophy course at night school as she turned 40. And the sitcom deals with how her family respond to their mother undertaking this course. There also emerged a set of primetime dramas featuring older professional women during this period, not least Thora Hird as a counsellor in The First Lady, but also two dramas featuring the former bad girls of British cinema, the Wicked Lady herself, Margaret Lockwood, and Googie Withers, otherwise known as the best bad girl in British cinema, upholding the law in justice and as a prison governor within these walls. And these two stars of British cinema were joined by the good girl of British cinema, Phyllis Calvert, as a professional agony aunt in Kate. But other series at this time, which I've included on the slide here, were Sian Phillips, who played Emmeline Pankhurst, and singer Georgia Brown as a suffragette, Annie Kenny in Shoulder to Shoulder, as well as the very successful singer-actor Annie Ross heading up a promotions team in Send In the Girls. So if we compare these texts to those of the sitcoms that were also produced in this same period, we can see there's clear class distinctions between the kinds of identities that populate each kind of text. So the sitcoms tend to focus on working class matriarchs, whereas these professional dramas focus more upon the lives of professional middle class identities. And in the case of justice and within these walls, I would suggest that the roles of these professional career women, roles that are usually reserved for men in this period, are allowed due to the overlapping features of age and the status of the former stars of British cinema, of both Margaret Lockwood and Googie Withers. Not only were these women marked out as exceptional, given that they were already professional career women, yes, stars of British cinema, but whose star personas had already transgressed the discourses and spaces associated with femininity, in other words, those more domesticated spaces that are inhabited by the heroines of the sitcoms of this period. Yet I would suggest the two women here, Margaret Lockwood and Googie Withers characters, were those former bad girls, were also reformed on television and became domesticated themselves, and indeed as represented no longer as bad girls, but rather as the upholders of law and justice. Yet here I want to return to Soap more specifically and analyse the representations of so-called older women in Coronation Street. Coronation Street was distinct when it appeared in 1960 because of its representations of a strong working class matriarchal community set in the north of England in Manchester, wherein there existed a range of feminine types inhabiting its community, and again many of which within that community were middle-aged women. Coronation Street's embodiment of a social realist aesthetic meant it resembled the new wave films of the 1950s and 60s, which themselves were nicknamed as kitchen sink dramas, such as Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. However, whereas the new wave films tended to focus on masculine identities, with few exceptions such as A Taste of Honey and The L-Shaped Room, Coronation Street was distinct from its filmic counterparts by making women, rather than men, the subject of its narrative, and indeed the norm by which the programmes are understood. So although soap has been criticised for reinforcing gender and age stereotypes, for things like the suffering matriarch, the battle axe and the spinster, such as the battle axe of Ina Sharples featured within the still on the slide here, It's also been soap has also been criticised for reinforcing the association of women in relation to feminine values and spaces such as the home, family, and caring responsibilities. But when soap opera came to be reappraised by feminist media academics in the 80s and 90s, what they suggested was actually that soap should be celebrated for being a space that actually gave expression to areas of culture tied to the feminine at a time in culture when, at a time in history, when those cultural values had been denigrated and undervalued. And indeed, in her lovely book on women in soap opera, Christine Geraghty has argued that while soap operas are known for their representation of strong matriarchs who are the moral and practical support to their families, she argues that more frequently than any other TV genre, soap feature women characters normally excluded by age, appearance, or status. And here she draws on Marian Jordan's seminal essay on Coronation Street from the early 1980s, who identified a range of positions held by women in programmes, particularly in Coronation Street. The grandmother type, married women and marriageable women. And Marian Jordan broke down those latter categories there, suggesting that those marriageable women were either mature, sexy women, spinsterly types, and young women. And therefore, the ensemble nature of soap means that it offers you as a number of different characters or a number of different variations within each character type, and often those characters are infused with comedy, so who we both identify with, as well as occasionally laugh at. But the comedy, because women are the subjects of those of the narrative, they are not merely the objectified or made to be the butt of the jokes. So these points of Geraghty and Jordan is evident if we look at the 11 women who featured in the most episodes in 1971, and I'm using 71 as because it's the year that Mavis appeared. She didn't appear until towards the end of that year, so she doesn't feature one of the 11 women who featured in the most episodes. But the year is useful as an example to show the range of feminities that inhabited Coronation Street. So out of the 11, most of them are married, and certainly the remaining one who isn't, Lucille Hewitt, in the corner here, in the left-hand lower corner. She's clearly of a young woman of marriageable criteria. But we also have spinsters and battle axes, as well as some more comedic characters of Hilda Ogden in particular, or Bet Lynch, or even Mrs. Walker herself, Annie Walker, in the top left-hand corner there. So what these examples tell us then is the nature of the long-running serial allows for greater character development, not just a proliferation of characters, but greater character development that allows to add nuance to those characters. The Coronation Street, like other soaps such as EastEnders, have their own biographers to keep a track of the long and rich histories of these characters, which allow them really to surpass two-dimensional stereotypes of working class femininity. Yet what is glaringly obvious from the selection of feminities from the early 70s is the street's overt whiteness and heteronormativity that was symptomatic of British television more broadly during this period. And again, one of the questions we can ask, which we'll come back to towards the end of this presentation, is how much has changed in terms of that level of diversity, and for soap and other TV dramas and sitcoms to address feminities other than white and straight femininities. So for now, what I want to explore is how Coronation Street represented these older, albeit white feminities that are usually excluded from other genres via the character of Mavis, particularly if we think back in 1971. So as I've mentioned, Mavis was played by Thelma Barlow, who made her first appearance as a regular in Coronation Street on the 11th of August 1971, when Thelma was 42 years old. Mavis arriving for Emily Nugent's engagement party, and Emily being introduced as her colleague stroke friend. And as you can see there, via dress, dialogue and mannerism, Mavis is very much introduced as a comedic type, her prudish personality heightened by the contrast between her and the other three women characters in this scene, the Ina Sharples, Bette Lynch and Betty Turpin. And the sub indicates perhaps that she's going to be another sort of perhaps spinsterly type. Yet her final line in this scene, that she preferred to be Hedy Lamarr, the glamorous seductress, rather than Anne and Eagle, the quintessential English femininity, suggests the more sort of repressed nature of Mavis that informs many of the storylines between her and her suitors over the years, namely Jerry Booth, Derek Wilton, Victor Pendlebury. But what we can draw from the example of Mavis is how middle-aged women of soap were represented as active, desiring and desired subjects well into middle age and beyond. Indeed, for Mavis, given that her character was middle-aged when she joined the street, her life really did begin in her 40s. Unfortunately for Mavis, but fun for us as the audience, if you've been fans of Coronation Street over the years, you'll know that the men in Mavis's life were just as reserved as she, which led to a great deal of frustration on the part of Mavis. Importantly, there were exceptions to this pattern of dithering suitors for Mavis, which also illustrates the way in which soap is structured by repetition and by disruption, which in this instance came in the form of a holiday romance when the women of Weatherfield won a Spot the Ball competition and found themselves on holiday in Mallorca in October 1974. And although it was her glamorous, the marriageable, sexy types of Bette Lynch and Rita Fairclough who were expected to attract some male attention, there was a comic reversal, and it was Mavis who attracted the attention of the handsome Pedro.
Schon finish?
Oh, it's all right. I don't mind. No, I really enjoy it, helping you backstage. Actually, it's not the first time. Backstage, I mean. I helped in a play that we did at home. The importance of being earnest. I don't know what that is in Spanish.
So while the holiday romance is shot via the codes of comedy in that first episode of Mallorca, the second episode of Mallorca is shot in a more serious tone for Mavis, where Pedro declares his love for her. And so, Mavis is allowed that holiday romance, and they part with a passionate embrace. So whilst it's clear that Rita and Bette are still held up as objects of sexual desirability, Pedro is also and equally held up as the object of the female gaze. And it is significant perhaps that he also appears younger than Mavis, so it plays with those codes around age, gender and desirability. The Mallorca episode also illustrates how representations of female friendship is central to the pleasures offered by Coronation Street during this period. Friendships in this instance of people like Mavis and Rita through the 26 years that Mavis starred in the street. And indeed, Rita is still in Coronation Street, and Barbara Knox, who plays Rita, turns 91 on the 30th of September this year. So it's female friendship and female solidarity rather than marriage which has been the constant not just for Mavis and Rita, but for women in soap generally. As Christine Geraghty has argued, it's too often assumed that soaps emphasise male-female relationships at the expense of others. In fact, because the central husband-wife relationship is such hard work for women characters, they need to be supported by other friendships which are more reliably sustaining. It's quite fitting in this respect that Mavis's final scenes are with Rita and other mature members of the Coronation Street cast. And Mavis's departure, and there's a clip there if you'd like to watch it, when she did leave Coronation Street, but her departure allows us to think about the exiting of older women in Coronation Street and in soaps more generally. For Res Jennings, she has argued that contemporary 21st century notions of age and generation embed identity within a restrictive, linear and normative chronology. These chronologies work to reinforce and reiterate ageist narratives that position aging as bleak decline. But as we've seen throughout soap in Coronation Street, narratives about middle-aged and older women are very much alive. And indeed, for Mavis and Rita, their time in the cabin shop together were very much active, visible, and valuable members of Coronation Street, Coronation Street's community. So when Mavis departs from Coronation Street post the loss of Derek to a heart attack in 1997, her exit from the soap was similarly marked by a new beginning, taking over running a guest house in Cartmel rather than marking the end of her life. And I think in this way, soaps have been really important for undermining those kind of normative linear narratives of structured around age and decline. So before I conclude this lecture, I want to point to one further significant way that soap has been important in narratives of women over 50 on television, and that's behind the scenes in television production. Hazel Adair, for instance, was 30 when she swapped acting for writing for television in 1951. Adair was acting in a BBC production of Ladies in Waiting in 1949, where she was encouraged by the then director-producer Joy Harrington to write for television, given the dearth of writers that they had around that time and the overwhelming need to find new writers for this new medium. So she began writing for children's television and then for Mrs. Dale's Diary. Adele also played a central role in the creation of the soaps that I mentioned earlier. She co-created, for instance, with John Gill Anthony, ITV's first daytime soap Sixpenny Corner, and co-wrote with Peter Ling the BBC early soap opera Compact, set in a woman's magazine and based upon her own experience of working for Woman's Own, along with Crossroads. So the latter soap was set in the Midlands Hotel and was extremely popular with audiences despite its shaky sets, which was said to be the inspiration for Victoria Wood's Acorn Antiques sketches. She also wrote episodes for Emergency Ward 10, which had been created by another pioneer, Tessa Diamond. And Adair also penned one of the earliest interracial kisses on television between Surgeon Dr. Louise Marler and Dr. Giles Farmer in Emergency Ward 10. Another noticeable writing trailblazer was Adele Rose, who began writing for Coronation Street in 1961. Adele was encouraged to write via her writing friend Jack Rosenthal. So, married with a young baby, Adele rang Harry Kershaw, the script editor for Coronation Street, and recalled how she came to write for the street. So Adele recalls saying to Kershaw, I said, you don't know me, but Jack has asked me to ring you, and I watch your show and I see it's got a lot of women in the cast. It's predominantly women, but you don't appear to have any women writers, I said. And I was born and bred in Salford, and I'm a woman, and those are the only two things I could offer. I couldn't offer any professional experience of any kind. At school I'd written plays and things and for drama groups when I was a teenager. And he said, come and see me. So in between, I think Carrie was on 3 hourly feeds. She was a very tiny baby. I grabbed a cab, didn't have a car or a driver in those days, and went to see him, and he gave me a trial script to write. And he must have liked it, because then he commissioned me. So Adele was 28 when she started writing for Coronation Street. She was the second woman to write for the series, but she was one of the longest serving script writers for Coronation Street, writing 457 scripts over a 37-year period. Until she left the soap not that long after Thelma Barlow left in 1998. So Adele was also the writer of the 2 episodes set in Mallorca. Indeed, the female trip to Mallorca was the idea of one of the series producer, Susie Hush, and the trip was an all-female cast and crew apart from the male director. And here's a photo courtesy of Adele Rose, which she passed on to me a few years ago when I had the privilege of interviewing her. And during that interview, she said, without any prompting, about how much she loved to write for Rita and Mavis, as well as for other famous duos such as the battles between Elsie Tanner and Ina Sharples. So Adele was a prolific writer of television. As well as writing for Coronation Street, she wrote for many other television series and created other television series between the 1960s and 2000s. Her credits are too long to list here, but she also contributed episodes to Z Cars, to Within These Walls, as well as creating a sitcom called Girls About Town, which was about two housewives in dialogue with the discourses of the women's liberation movement circulating during this period. So again, fictions which are slightly older, more mature femininities than the young singletons of things like Take Three Girls. So Adele also wrote Second Chance, a six-part drama series for ITV in 1981, which was semi-autobiographical and follows the characters of Kate and Chris, who, after 18 years of marriage and are hitting middle age, decide to get divorced. But at the other end of the age spectrum, if you like, she also wrote, teen dramas. It's one most famously, Biker Grove, for the BBC in 1989, which was a teen drama about a youth centre in Newcastle, and which launched the careers of Ant and Dec and Jill Halfpenny. So, as these two examples illustrate then, Hazel Adair, Adele Rose, we can see the significance of soap in the careers of several women writers of television, and who started writing in their 20s and 30s, but who went on to have long and successful careers writing for TV and indeed film well into their 50s and 60s. And more generally, my research has suggested that while there may be relatively fewer women writers, by way of comparison with men in television, it's soap where women have had a higher percentage or higher proportion of representation as part of the writing workforce. So this paper has explored the representation and positioning of older women in drama and soaps, particularly Coronation Street, between 1960 and the 1990s. Going forward, if this research is to be extended, there are three pressing issues to consider. And I'm sure there are others, but these are the three most pressing issues that I think are important. Firstly, it would be interesting to look at what has happened to the representation of older women in soap opera between the 1990s and the contemporary period. As this article here from ITV suggests, middle-aged and older women remain central to Coronation Street, both narratively and in terms of marketing the programme, but there's clearly a shift in terms of the way older femininities are represented and indeed mediated. Has this been the same in all soap opera? How and why is this the case? How do we make sense of these shifts? And crucially, what do they tell us about ideas around femininity and ageing in the contemporary period in the UK? Overlapping with this first issue would be the exploration of representations of older women that have emerged since the 1980s in a range of professional women and female ensemble dramas. What are the similarities and differences in these forms, and how do they represent the subjectivities of older women? These first two tasks need to be approached through an intersectional lens that explores representations of gender and age in relation to a wider range of factors, including race, sexuality, disability, and class. It's through such analysis that we can begin to identify and address the ideas, values, and power dynamics that underpin cultural systems of representation, both past and present, and begin to understand both the pleasures and challenges of older women viewers consuming TV fictions. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the festival.